So, can potassium help you build muscle? Now that I have your attention, let's talk a little bit about the importance of potassium for insulin production. Oftentimes, the hormone insulin is actually demonized, but it's not really insulin that we want to be afraid of. Rather, it's insulin resistance. And insulin resistance occurs when our cells begin to become insensitive to the signal of insulin, meaning that the insulin isn't actually doing its job. And we actually want to maintain insulin sensitivity as best as possible because insulin is extremely important. Not only does insulin allow us to keep a stable blood glucose level by allowing glucose entrance into our cells, but it's important for a myriad of other things, such as aiding in muscle protein synthesis or the building of muscle, and even helping facilitate what's called neuroplasticity, which is the expansion and growth of our brain. Now, obviously, insulin is extremely important, but let's talk about insulin production for a moment. So when our blood glucose is elevated, typically after we eat a meal, this glucose will enter into what are called the pancreatic beta cells, and these are just the cells in the pancreas that produce insulin. And that glucose is subsequently turned into what's called ATP. So the more glucose we have entering into our pancreas, the more ATP we'll produce. And what this ATP does is it will actually bind to and close a potassium transporter on the cell. And this causes calcium to accumulate inside of the cell. And since calcium has a positive charge, this will raise the voltage of the cell. And luckily, we have another channel on the cell called a voltage-gated calcium channel. And in response to this increased voltage, calcium can then enter into our pancreatic beta cell. And finally, this calcium will actually allow for little vesicles, which are kind of just like envelopes, that sit inside of the cell that contain insulin to bind to the membrane and release the insulin into the bloodstream. So if we look at it, what are two really important micronutrients? The first is certainly going to be potassium. Without enough potassium, we won't build up a high enough voltage to allow the second step of calcium entrance to occur. So even when glucose is getting into the beta cell because we have high blood glucose, without the potassium, we won't get the signal. And the other important nutrient is going to be calcium. Because let's say we do have enough potassium, but when we open up those voltage-gated calcium channels, we don't have enough calcium inside of our bloodstream, then we may be at risk of not having enough calcium to allow insulin to be released. So what does this mean for us? This doesn't mean going and taking calcium and potassium supplements. Instead, we can simply just eat fresh foods that are going to have an abundance of potassium, including vegetables, fruit, and meat. And one extremely underlooked source of calcium is actually sardines. Unfortunately, this is because of the bones. With that being said, a calcium deficiency is far less prevalent than a potassium deficiency. And it's not because our food doesn't have calcium or potassium, but it's because we're eating a lot of the processed foods where potassium and calcium simply are not abundant. But we can get all of the calcium and potassium we need by simply eating meat, fruit, vegetables, and other whole foods. So, can potassium help you build muscle?